Today, something a little different. This is a piece called True Selves, which I wrote as an introduction to one of the sections of my own teacher, Barry Magid's forthcoming book of Dharma talks. I don't know whether it's going to be out next year or the year following. What he asked me to do was to write a piece which situated his own teaching, what I saw as the really important aspects of the way that he's tried to develop Ordinary Mind Zen, and then to put that in the context of where I thought I was trying to take it next. So, True Selves. If Jōko Beck was the teacher who most clearly showed us that psychological practice within Zen was not only permissible but essential, then Barry Magid has taught us that exactly the same is true of the idea of self. While Jōko's psychology was constructed ad hoc from what presented itself to her in the California of the 1980s, centrally the idea of a life constricted and regulated by negative core beliefs acquired in early childhood, Barry Magid has brought to bear a lifetime of professional practice at the cutting edge of American psychoanalysis, offering a wider, deeper and more coherent engagement with the psychological processes of both the specifics of Zen practice and of our life as it is. Open almost any book by a contemporary Zen teacher and you will find traces of the Buddhist truism that the self doesn't really exist, paradoxically linked to a moralizing disparagement of our perennial selfishness, albeit now often psychologized as ego. While it didn't significantly impact her teaching, Jōko Beck herself seemed happy enough with the traditional view that our aim is to become a no-self who sees life as it really is and so responds intuitively and spontaneously to every situation as it arises, without the need for conscious thought. In the Chinese tradition, this is known as Wu Wei. The only remaining questions about life become purely technical ones. Which aisle is tinned soup on? Is it time to get someone to fix the roof? But, as Barry tells us, quote, the Heart Sutra insists that if the self doesn't exist, neither does the floor you're sitting on or the air you're breathing or the sun that's shining. This is good Zen and sound Buddhist philosophy. If I really am, as Zen so often reminds us, just this, that is so not in any mystical or transcendental sense, but as the just this of my ordinary experience, as this ordinary being in this moment. This self that I am is not hidden, but here in plain sight, a self that practices within the delusion and suffering of an embodied being, born into a language and world not of its own creation or choosing. As Barry says, the idea of no self is meant to be a kind of relief from the tyranny of self, but when you talk to people about what that would mean to them, almost inevitably it's some version of wanting one part of the self to be free of another. It might seem sadly disillusioning that one of the primary motivations behind our aspirations for spiritual practice is finding some peace and quiet from ourselves, or at least from those aspects of ourselves we want to deny or disown. Barry shows us how we all become involved in a curative fantasy about how Zen will fix what we see as some fundamental lack in our lives, attempting to use our practice as a means of feeling in control. Understanding that the working through of our curative fantasies isn't a side issue, but a central aspect of our Zen practice, is one of Barry's most important contributions to a Zen tradition that, while appearing entirely unaware that such curative fantasies exist, has thereby shaped and fostered their creation. No self, its mirror concept of true self, and even the fantasy of enlightenment, can all too easily encourage us in using our practice to evade, in the name of practice itself, facing the reality of being this self, the me of my experiencing, right here and right now in this moment. Such fantasies point us away from the actual emptiness of self that the Heart Sutra insists on, are always already being not separate with the world. This self that I am is always relational, always a self with others, always a self in the world. Too often Zen practice has been seen as aiming at an equanimity of self-sufficiency and imperturbability that brackets out experiencing the reality of this connectedness that we all are. Such practices, again quoting Barry, almost explicitly try to turn a relational problem into a one-person problem, where the problems that you have in your life with people in the real world don't have to be solved between you and other people or in the world, but they're going to be solved internally. It's to avoid the relational, the literally vulnerable dependence on other people and attachments and our embeddedness in our social, relational and physical world. So, none of this is to do with our supposed moral selfishness. None of this is to do with the illusion of having a self. All of these issues are exactly problems of self, a self that is real only in that it's always relational, situated and changing. We might want to think of it as more of a verb. Talk about our selfing, more a verb than a noun, and talk of self and selves rather than the self. As with Philip Bromberg's explorations of the multiple and transitory self-states that we each are. I am not one but many. I am multitudes. It would seem that the delusion of self and the delusion of no self form a pair. We're invited to imagining ourselves as fixed and separate, and then instructed that it's this very idea that is the cause of our suffering, and that hence that our liberation lies only in abandoning it. The reality of self is far more complex, and our attempts at disavowal can only ever return us to a hidden practice of self that is, as Barry has shown us better than anyone, sterile and often damaging. Barry was understandably attracted to the work that Jōko Beck had begun in California in the 1980s to address the problems of a Zen tradition still in denial about the fallout from the unresolved psychological issues of many of its own teachers and leaders. It's here that in being both Zen teacher and a practicing and teaching analyst, Barry has been exceptionally well placed to examine how psychoanalysis might best inform our actual Zen practice. John Welwood's notion of spiritual bypassing, best known in Jack Engler's aphoristic, "You have to be somebody before you can be nobody," had suggested that psychological integration of self should be seen as the necessary prelude to advanced spiritual practice. You have to be somebody before you can be nobody and no self. Magid's radical insight is that, on the contrary, our psychological work on the self isn't something to go beyond in pursuit of the truly and transcendently spiritual, but that the question of self is that of our practice as a whole. It's here that Barry shows us how radical Jōko Beck's shift away from monastic and priestly forms of Zen was. There is nothing in the Dharma that cannot be practiced in lay life, and his role in the formation of the Lay Zen Teachers Association was a logical development of this understanding. Jōko Beck's Everyday Zen was published in 1989, the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Followed by Nothing Special in 1993, her two books neatly bracket Francis Fukuyama's influential The End of History, 1992, with its falsely promised post-Cold War world in which politics and ideology were now at an end, and our societies in need only of purely technocratic and managerial regulation. By a no-self? A century earlier, Sigmund Freud had begun to develop new therapeutic techniques to treat the personal psychosomatic sufferings of a middle class experiencing the individualization and social fragmentation of industrial capitalism. In locating the causes of such suffering as essentially personal, hidden within the individual psyche, Freudian analysis set the model for other modern substitutes for a still dominant Christianity to exclude the properly social and political, and in this way provided a template for the reception of Zen in America. In a world where we're told to take it as gospel that our happiness or suffering, our success or failure are always the result of personal choices for which we're solely individually responsible, and usually that happiness and success are only one more purchase away. Those alienated from organised religion and from the competitive atomization of the consumer society might equally find themselves attracted to either psychoanalysis or to Buddhism in search of finding personal authenticity as a true self, or the cancelling of their personal problems in becoming a no-self. The reception of both Zen and psychoanalysis in the United States was favoured by this enforced competitive individualism of American society. But it's a favouring that has always invited complicity. In applying to Zen the insights of the relational turn of American psychoanalysis since the 1980s, Barry Magid offers us a very necessary path forward, showing how neither personal psychological development nor our real inner complexity can be thought of independently from our relationships with other selves. Jessica Benjamin's understanding of self as arising out of mutual recognition, is particularly significant here. Benjamin shows how the child's first formation of self necessarily emerges from the sharing of joy and pleasure with her mother, a mutually affecting interaction, leading to a genuinely mutual recognition of each other's subjectivity. In psychoanalytic terms, that their intersubjectivity is not reducible to the effect of the introjection of parental objects into the infant psyche. Mutual recognition of each other's subjectivity, enabling Benjamin to develop a psychoanalytic practice that sees self as genuinely relational rather than purely intrapsychic, inside. Philip Bromberg's theorization of self as a series of discrete self-states that may be shared between individuals takes us further in the direction of self as process, as a permanent work in progress, a self constituted out of a continuous and open responsiveness to other selves and to the world. A self that is always, in Zen terms, not one, not two. Barry shows us how a relational approach to our selfing provides valuable resources for the development of the more psychologically minded Zen that Jōko Beck pioneered. One that moves definitively beyond the simple first person of, it's all about me, to include the properly intersubjective, the second person, you and I, where neither of us imagine self or other as ever being fully formed or fixed. But we know each other as open. That's empty in the properly philosophical Buddhist sense. Such a practice of self makes possible a more fully embodied and granular understanding of the central Buddhist concept of our being not separate. My own work as a teacher aims to take this further, emphasising in turn the third person we and they. My 11 years spent as a Buddhist prison chaplain and our collective sharpening of focus in response to spiralling inequality, to Black Lives Matter, to #MeToo, to Gaza, on the first and now second Trump presidencies, have shown ever more clearly how the specifics of our selfing, of being the self of this place at this moment, always depend on what we think of as the social, the political, the the economic. These aspects of our lives as they are, and the shared feelings and emotions that accompany them, have been excluded by a narrowly spiritual or even a narrowly psychological understanding of self within Zen. Vital then to bear witness and practice skillful action upaya, with awareness of them, and so find new points of engagement with our practice both on and off the cushion. It's here that I can draw on my own training and teaching as a cultural historian and cultural theorist. Contemporary work on affect, what we each experience as my feelings, my emotions, emphasises the pre-individual and trans-individual form of much of our experiencing, and hence of our loves and hates of our desire itself. Just to emphasise pre-individual and trans-individual, terms coined by Gilbert Simondon in his groundbreaking work on individuation as process. Back to process. As our core practice, our core Zen practice of Zazen is in one sense nothing but an awareness of our experiencing of affect, feeling and emotion in all its forms, then as Zen students we're uniquely well placed to explore this. If I first come to be this self, to know myself as a self, in seeing my mother smiling at the sight of my smile, as we play peekaboo, then what kind of self am I as the bearer of the gender assigned on my birth certificate? In responding to the policeman's, "Hey, you, stop," or in reading the balance on my mortgage statement? And the self responding to the look in my lover's eyes, or to the face on the billboard or social media feed promising, "You could be me, you could have me." Or when I'm playing in the park with my children or joining others on a protest. We also need to ask about how far becoming this self relies on the excluding of the other. We are law-abiding because you are a criminal. We prosecute street crime harshly, but we reward corporate greed. We are self-reliant because you are a scrounger. We give to the haves what we take from the have-nots. I am one of us because you are one of them. And we build walls of race, class and gender across our minds, our cities and our borders. This relates directly to practicing the Zenkai or precepts, not as rules to be obeyed, but as an ongoing and evolving ethos or form of life, offering a trans-individual ethical framing for the experiencing of our most personal seeming feelings. This is where new concepts such as equilibrity or civility, developed by the philosopher Etienne Balibar as part of a political anthropology drawing on readings of Spinoza, Hegel and Marx, help us to think beyond our conventional understanding and experiencing of self. We might consider this work with the Zenkai as part of a wider practice of caring. Caring, aka compassion, caring for our very different selves, for each other, for our communities, and for all the sentient and non-sentient beings with whom we share this world. Care that does not remain at the level of sentiment, but addresses the concrete specifics and politics of our individual and collective lives. Sit zazen, take out the trash and, as Barry says, make your bed. But also share, study, organise, take part. Care is always not separate with our understanding, aka wisdom, and so exploring for ourselves how contemporary developments within the European tradition parallel and intersects with Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka philosophy, that philosophy which is the definitive statement of emptiness and non-separation within Mahayana Buddhism, well, that can also only be productive. At a time when fascism, however we define it, is no longer a historical memory, but a present spectre in the heartlands of Western liberal democracies, well then a fully relational and trans-individual understanding of the self is more needed than ever, with disengagement really no longer an option. If Jōko Beck took Zen out of the Zendo to meet with our individual life as it is, then it's Barry Magid who's shown a path for Zen to engage more fully with the world, not least in his recognition and insistence that self is at the heart of our practice. To continue and to expand on their work could not be more urgent. Thank you. And homage to my teacher.